Pour la 5e année consécutive, le forum Galien Afrique se déroule en terre sénégalaise du 6 au 9 décembre 2022. Le forum Galien Afrique offrira une plateforme d'échange exceptionnelle autour du thème « Accélérer la marche de l'Afrique vers la couverture sanitaire universelle ». Placé sous la présidence effective de son Excellence M. Macky Sall, président de la République du Sénégal, le forum Galien Afrique réunira des experts scientifiques des secteurs de la santé, de l'économie, de l'environnement, d'éminentes personnalités politiques et de la société civile, d'anciens récipiendaires de prix Nobel, des universitaires et des centaines d'étudiants en médecine et pharmacie, ainsi que des jeunes innovateurs. Cette 5e édition du forum, avec 1500 participants, sera organisée en format présentiel et virtuel avec, du 6 au 9 décembre 2022, un forum des jeunes, un forum des femmes et un forum scientifique. Le vendredi 9 décembre 2022 se tiendra une cérémonie en présentiel au cours de laquelle, pour la seconde fois, le prix Galien Afrique, qui consacre la recherche, l'innovation, la santé et la technologie, sera décerné. Du 6 au 9 décembre, le forum Galien Afrique fait de Dakar la capitale africaine de la santé, de l'innovation et de la recherche.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour encore une fois, mesdames et messieurs. C'est un grand plaisir pour nous d'organiser ce symposium qui est un symposium qui pour nous est d'actualité, mais également est un élément de repérage par rapport à ce que nous voulons faire pour l'Afrique. C'est un symposium qui va être co-chair par M. SEYDI de la Fondation Bill et Melinda Gates, qui est le Regional Director pour l'Afrique, et moi-même, Professeur Oumar SECK. Je voudrais vous dire que nous parlons de futur, de la santé et la résilience économique en Afrique. C'est assez large comme élément, mais il faut que vous sachiez que ça nous permet d'englober beaucoup de thématiques. Parce que quand on parle du futur de l'Afrique au plan de la santé et la résilience économique, on ne parle pas simplement de la santé à laquelle les gens pensent d'habitude, c'est-à-dire les soins, les médecins, les infirmiers, les sages-femmes. Il s'agit aujourd'hui d'une nécessaire approche pluridisciplinaire et multisectorielle. C'est pour ça qu'on a parlé souvent maintenant de One Health, mais également que l'on parle de la nécessité de travailler avec toutes les disciplines pour pouvoir gérer les problèmes. La pandémie à la COVID-19 nous a montré clairement que non seulement il y avait un diagnostic qu'il fallait faire au plan médical, épidémiologique et autres, mais l'impact était tel que tous les secteurs ont été touchés. Ne serait-ce que si on prend l'éducation, où on a vu qu'on ne pouvait pas parler de Covid sans penser aux enfants qui ne sont plus à l'école, mais également aux jeunes filles qui vont perdre toute la scolarité et peut-être qui seront mariées plus jeunes et qui auront peut-être des grossesses précoces, etc. Donc, si on se limite au secteur de la santé, on va être vraiment, comme on dit, complètement out. Il faudra qu'on reprenne les choses. Donc, on voudrait dès maintenant gérer cela et de cette manière. Je voudrais aussi rendre hommage à M. Mohamed PATE, qui est le chair de ce groupe qui a été formé et qui m'a demandé d'être le co-chair de cette commission qui est auprès du Lancet et qui va travailler sur ce sujet-là. Nous avons eu une première réunion en mars au Sénégal et nous avons eu l'appui d'ailleurs du président de la République qui pensait que c'était quelque chose d'extrêmement important pour l'Union africaine Et donc, ils attendent tous avec impatience que l'on puisse leur apporter les recommandations nécessaires. Mais nous avons vu aussi qu'il y avait un impact économique important, et c'est pour ça qu'il y a des groupes de travail qui sont focus sur l'économie. Mais également, on s'est rendu compte qu'il y a toute une histoire. Quand on parle de l'Afrique, il faut aussi penser à la colonisation, à l'esclavage, c'est-à-dire qu'on a un héritage de tout ça. Et c'est peut-être ce qui bloque certaines choses et il faudrait les identifier. Et nous avons d'ailleurs un groupe qui s'occupe que de ça. C'est pour vous dire qu'il y a de nombreux groupes de travail et chacun est en train de faire ce qu'il doit faire pour qu'on puisse se retrouver. Et nous travaillons en ligne, nous travaillons en présentiel, donc c'est un travail intéressant, important. Et nous espérons que cette étape est aussi une étape importante. Nous utilisons toutes les opportunités qui sont offertes pour pouvoir rencontrer les gens, leur parler et pouvoir prendre des conseils pour que notre document soit un document qui soit vraiment utile pour l'Afrique. Monsieur le co-chair, monsieur SEYDI, je voudrais vous donner tout de suite la parole parce que nous avons, je crois que je ne parlerai plus jusqu'à la fin, nous avons un calendrier qui est très chargé et nous ne pouvons pas, disons, faire plus d'1 heure et on a déjà commencé en retard. Donc, je vais vous donner le leadership par rapport à cela et je sais que vous connaissant, vous allez nous gérer cette affaire de main de maître. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre. Je tiens tout d'abord à dire que je suis très honoré de partager ce plateau avec vous et d'être un co-modérateur. Vous continuez toujours à nous inspirer, donc c'est vraiment un grand honneur. Quand je pense à ce que vous venez de dire, je vais rajouter rapidement, donc je le fais en anglais par rapport à la première personne qui va intervenir. This was really very well said and framed by the co-chair. It was a health and economic crisis, but it went beyond that in terms of the implication of COVID and the lessons that we've learned. So the first question I wanted to ask is to Dr. Mohamed PATE, who is the co-chair of FHERA, this initiative. Dr. PATE is with the Harvard University and was formerly a Minister of Health in Nigeria. Early on in the initiative, I had a very interesting call when he was trying to explain to me the burning platform. Would you remember some of the things you said at that time? What was the burning platform from putting this initiative that is really Africa-led and Africa-owned?
Well, thank you, Oumar. And also let me appreciate my co-chair, Minister SECK, for inspiring leadership that has taken us very far within a short period of time. And also to the President of the Republic for his endorsement of this initiative when we met in March. I think Africa has multiple transitions that are underway. There's a demographic transition in terms of the youthfulness and where that is going, aging that is going on, urbanization that is all happening in our continent at the moment. There's the epidemiological transition, which has been discussed during these last few days, but also is in the background in terms of background diseases that we have had, the non-communicable diseases, injuries, and nutritional-related diseases. The economic transitions that are on the continent that are also happening. But when you look at the population health outcomes on the continent relative to other parts of the world, life expectancy is lower and significant burden of diseases, whether it's maternal and child health, whether we're seeing preventable diseases. That is, in a way, where we are in terms of population health outcomes, including a huge burden of undernutrition in our continent. In terms of universal health coverage, while there has been some progress in terms of service coverage over the last 20 years in many parts of the continent, there is significant portion of the African population that do not have access to the most basic healthcare services, almost 40%. And on financial protection, an important goal for health systems, in fact, it's been stagnant for the last 20 years. A significant number of our people are accessing health, but they're also paying more out of pocket for that health and being tipped into poverty. Then came COVID. COVID disrupted quite a bit and took us much further behind, whether it's immunization or other essential services. And then pockets of conflict that we have, particularly here in the West African region in the Sahel, which further really challenges the situation of the health of the people of the continent. So in the context of the Africa 2063 vision of a people-oriented, peaceful, integrated continent, we thought this platform convening a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional group of leaders, practitioners, scientists, academics, to really reflect on the lessons of health systems development on the continent from the past, several decades, including the colonial past, because the health systems on the continent are largely influenced also by the colonial experiences of the countries. If you look at Anglophone, Francophone, or Lusophone countries, the orientations of the health system are very different. So to study that and draw some important lessons. And then more recently, in terms of the COVID pandemic, there are important lessons for the continent. A large portion of the lessons that have been distilled are more global. But what does it mean on the continent of Africa? What have we learned as a continent? And to use those and the analysis that we would do as a group in consultation with policymakers to pinpoint options for improving that future that we think can be bright. So with the president, we've identified regulatory framework, and that came up severally in this Galien forum, and beginning to articulate how that can be dealt with. To reimagine health systems, what does it mean? Africa doesn't have to follow the trajectory of the West in terms of heavily curative-oriented healthcare system. How do we tilt that to the preventive side, whether it's vaccination and a lot of other things that we could do to actually reorient around the prevention side? Is that something that we could actually take on as a continent? What does it really mean? The youth, a powerful youth population that is on the continent, very engaged. We met some of them yesterday. How do we engage them in shaping that future that they will live through, whether it's in sexual and reproductive health, whether it's in human resources in the front lines that are needed for service delivery or for public health? Those are important areas that are unique for the continent at this moment, and it cannot be transposed from other parts of the world. Local manufacturing and many other initiatives are underway, and that is good to continue, but I think the innovations that are needed in terms of data systems, digital transformation, to leapfrog our health systems to solve problems on the continent is an important aspect. So for that, for instance, looking at constraints to scaling innovations, there are thousands of innovations every day, but they don't get to the scale that they need to. So as FHERA, we've commissioned a working group to look at what are the constraints. Are they to do with policy? Are they to do with regulations? Are they to do with financing? And then the interdisciplinary aspect. Our colleague Kiros in Colombia is leading the working group on climate change and health, not only sort of environment, indoor pollution, but also climate change and health from adaptation. And then food systems and nutrition is an important element if we're thinking about the population health outcomes, not just healthcare. So that's the perspective that we have taken. And it's not duplicating, but it's trying to connect the dots and to come out with actionable recommendations, including for how to unlock the private sector, which is a key part of what we have on the continent in the mixed healthcare system. There are several themes that we are tackling as part of this initiative, and many of my colleagues on this panel are leading some of that, and several others also who are not here. So we're in the early stages, but we do expect that the Lancet Commission report will come out in the third quarter of 2023. And it will be a message that will resonate with leaders, and that's why we're engaging with them continually over the time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that very helpful overview that goes deep into some of the root causes, including the colonial past and other things that you mentioned. So now let me turn to Agnès Soukat. Agnès est directrice du secteur social à l'AFD à Paris. Et Agnès est aussi un commissioner à FHERA. Donc, Agnès, si nous tenons compte de votre expérience à l'OMS, en regardant votre parcours, vous avez aussi travaillé à la Banque africaine de développement et aussi au groupe de la Banque mondiale. Donc, ce que tous les trois, nous avons en fait, je dirais, en commun. Quel bilan faites-vous des tendances observées sur le financement de la santé publique en Afrique? Et aussi, en écoutant les propos du docteur Mohamed PATE, quelle autre chose vous inspire en partageant justement cette réflexion avec nous, surtout en tenant compte justement du grand défi maintenant à relever avec l'assiette fiscale des pays qui sont devenus vraiment, c'est une assiette fiscale très réduite. Voilà, vous avez la parole. Et merci.
Merci beaucoup. La question du financement de la santé et de la relation entre l'économie et la santé est aujourd'hui en Afrique au cœur de la question du futur de l'économie africaine et de la reprise économique après la crise Covid. La crise Covid est un signal fort à la communauté internationale, est un signal fort à la population humaine mondiale des crises qui sont à venir et qui sont liées aux changements environnementaux, en particulier le changement climatique, mais également la perte de biodiversité, les pollutions, les évolutions démographiques et la liaison entre la démographie et la nature. Et qu'est-ce que nous pouvons apprendre de l'analyse de comment nous avons financé la santé dans le passé? Alors pour ça, nous pouvons vraiment nous appuyer sur des données qui existent depuis près de 20 ans, assez solides sur tous les pays, sur la dépense de santé. Et la dépense de santé, comment elle est liée à la dépense publique et de façon générale à l'économie. Et là, ce que l'on peut voir, c'est que au cours des 20 dernières années en Afrique, la dépense santé a augmenté, c'est vrai, mais elle a augmenté essentiellement parce que l'économie a été en croissance et la dépense santé a été tirée essentiellement par la croissance économique. Si l'on regarde la nature de cette dépense santé, alors on voit que la plus grande partie du financement de la santé aujourd'hui en Afrique vient des ménages. En tout cas, en Afrique subsaharienne, c'est un petit peu moins vrai sur l'Afrique du Nord, où il y a une forte dépense publique de santé, moins vrai sur l'Afrique du Sud, mais à peu près tout le reste de l'Afrique, en fait, la dépense privée est la dépense la plus importante dans les dépenses des ménages, dans les dépenses de santé. Le deuxième moteur de la dépense de santé, c'est l'aide au développement. Et l'aide au développement a augmenté au cours des dernières années, mais elle a augmenté à peu près au même rythme que la croissance économique. Et c'est vraiment la croissance économique et son effet sur les recettes fiscales qui a vraiment tiré la dépense de santé vers le haut. En revanche, et c'est ça qui est vraiment une préoccupation aujourd'hui sur l'Afrique subsaharienne, c'est que la dépense de santé publique en pourcentage de l'ensemble de la dépense publique a en fait baissé. Et donc, en fait, l'objectif d'Abuja de 15% qui avait été adopté par les chefs d'État, non seulement n'a pas été atteint, mais en fait, le pourcentage que les gouvernements allouent à la santé dans les ressources domestiques est en recul. Et c'est pas tout à fait clair pourquoi, mais ce qui est clair, c'est que l'on voit une forte relation entre la montée de l'aide en santé et la baisse du financement domestique. Et donc, il y a un fort effet d'éviction, un effet de substitution sur la dépense santé domestique. Et lorsqu'on regarde les dépenses de santé de 2020, donc les dépenses, comment les pays ont réagi à la crise Covid-19, le rapport est sorti, le rapport sur les comptes nationaux de la santé de l'OMS est sorti hier. Et en fait, ce que l'on voit qui est étonnant, c'est qu'il n'y a pas eu d'augmentation de la dépense de santé venue de l'aide extérieure en 2020. La dépense de santé qui a augmenté, c'est la dépense domestique et elle s'est faite à la fois aux dépens des autres secteurs et à la fois à travers le creusement de la dette. Et aux dépens des autres secteurs, dans le sens où la dépense publique de santé domestique en Afrique a augmenté, mais la dépense publique totale n'a pas augmenté. Et donc, ce qui s'est passé en 2020, c'est un retrait des dépenses sur les autres secteurs qui a probablement aussi contribué à la crise économique et qui contribue à la crise économique d'aujourd'hui. Et aujourd'hui, la question avec cette crise économique qui perdure et qui est aggravée maintenant par la crise alimentaire, par la crise de l'Ukraine, par la désorganisation des chaînes d'approvisionnement et la montée des problématiques climatiques et de la nécessité de répondre aux crises climatiques, ce que l'on voit aujourd'hui, c'est que les pays africains aujourd'hui ont très peu d'espace fiscal pour revenir sur le financement domestique. Et donc aujourd'hui, la question clé, c'est comment mobiliser les financements, et en particulier les financements publics de développement, et donc le prêt pour le développement, à des taux avantageux, à des taux concessionnels, pour reprendre les investissements à la fois dans la santé et dans les autres secteurs, et dans une perspective d'adaptation au changement climatique. Donc l'accès au financement concessionnel, l'accès au financement en prêt, est extrêmement fondamental aujourd'hui et l'ensemble des banques publiques de développement doivent vraiment répondre à cet enjeu à travers une alliance qui permet de relancer les investissements vers les objectifs de développement durable.
Merci beaucoup. Let me check first whether we have the three panelists who are supposed to join us online. Dr. Vera SONGWE? Vera, do we have you online?
Yes, you do.
Oh, fantastic.
Hi, how are you, Oumar? How are you?
Doing very well. Good to hear your voice.
Sorry, I couldn't be with you in Dakar.
Oh, fantastic. So, well, maybe I can just turn now straight to you because this conversation, as you know, given your role, your involvement with FHERA as a commissioner, and I also want to tap on your previous experiences, including the most recent one as a UN Undersecretary in charge of a very, very big agenda in the continent with UNECA. And now I'll turn a little bit to another topic because as Mohammed and also the two co-chairs actually of FHERA and Professor Oumar Kolsek, we're talking about this initiative that goes beyond just health. So given your expertise, I would like to turn a little bit into a different topic here to get your perspective on how would you define any appropriate approaches in terms of liquidity and sustainability, in terms of financing. I know you've been busy talking about SDR and all that sort of thing. So what is the latest thinking, Vera, on that in terms of what you would like this audience to hear and know about? Over to you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much again for inviting me here. I am going to try, I think I see, of course, Professor Oumar Kolsek. We go a very, very long way. You know, I think back to Ebola and the nights when together we were up until 3 a.m., you know, with our fingers crossed, worrying about whether something will happen in Senegal or not, and managing that process. You know, fast forward to 2022 or 2020, and we were again up all night worrying about what would happen with the COVID. But I think this just goes to show that, you know, crises are going to come. Now they're coming much faster and much closer together, actually, and so we need to do more. Of course, Mohammed, you, Oumar, everybody else who is on the panel, it's a pleasure to be with you as well. We've all sort of seen this and gone through it, and under the leadership of Professor, Minister, Ambassador, our Maricold SECK, who has been at the top of all these institutions doing these things. Thank you very much, really, for pulling this conversation together. I really appreciate it. Maybe to link to the conversation on liquidity, because people will say, what does health have to do with liquidity? But, I started by talking about Ebola. We can go back to HIV/AIDS, and then we can come back to COVID. But each time we had one of this, COVID, we call the pandemic, the others, I think AIDS also, when it began, we had that same crisis. Mohammed, you were there at the White House with the President Obama for Ebola. What happened immediately was everybody thought Africa was going to collapse. Africa cannot afford this. Africa will not have the fiscal space to respond. There is the conversation and the connection between, the health crisis and macroeconomic management. And I think what has ended up happening is that, every time there's a crisis, rather than say that Africa needs liquidity or more fiscal space to respond to that crisis, the global community quickly rushes to Africa is going to collapse. Africa is going to become insolvent. Africa can no longer pay its debt. And I am very happy. Well, I shouldn't say I'm very happy, but something happened very recently, which the whole world focused on. It was the 44 days of crisis in the United Kingdom after the fast and furious sort of new fiscal policy. What happened was interest rates skyrocketed. They tripled. And the government of the UK could no longer service its debt, because they did not have access to liquidity. The government of the UK was not becoming insolvent. They were not getting into a debt crisis. For those 44 days, it was too expensive for them to access credit to be able to respond to the basic needs of their populations. Households could no longer service their mortgage, particularly if they had flexible mortgages, which were dependent on monthly interest rates, because they no longer had the money. If your mortgage was, let's say, 50,000 CFAs, all of a sudden you woke up one morning and you had to start paying 150 because interest rates had gone up very high. It didn't mean that all of a sudden you were bankrupt or that you had poorly managed your finances or, you didn't have foresight. It just meant that there was a sudden shock to your economy. The reason I say this is because what we lived as Africa during the COVID crisis was a sudden shock to our economies. It was a shock that was not internally stimulated, right? It was an external shock. And this was, we now talk about the poly crisis. And I don't know the audience, but I think there's translation because I see everybody with translation. I was thinking, should I go to French? But we're talking about the poly crisis, COVID, climate, cost or inflation, and conflict on our continent. All of these things, conflict, Russia, Ukraine, all of these things external. But they have all meant that all of a sudden food is more expensive, or our interest rates, because of high interest rates, our debt to GDP has gone up, and we have to pay bullet payment and we don't have the liquidity. And so what we are calling for, we just set up when I was at ECA and now independently, the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, is to say when there is a shock in Europe, in the United Kingdom, or even in the United States, there is a way of getting liquidity immediately to address that shock. It doesn't mean that you're going to be in debt crisis, but you have liquidity. There are institutions that do that. For the developing world, we don't have those kinds of institutions. So essentially, when there is a crisis, we all cry debt, and then we say, go and get a debt negotiation. And debt negotiations normally take a year and a half. Your crisis would have killed you already. So essentially it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because by the time you get into a debt negotiation and you fix it and you finish it, then you really are in debt because you're in trouble. And so I think that this is one of the conversations that we have been pushing, is to say, let's treat Africa as we treat everybody else. When there is a short-term shock, let's give liquidity and then begin to figure out how we go forward, as opposed to just immediately crying debt and saying, and the proof is, Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia that said, okay, if you want us to cry debt, we'll cry debt, we put our hands up. None of them has got a debt restructuring yet. How many months, how many years after COVID, right? So the fact they haven't got to the debt restructuring and they have not gotten access to new financing. So essentially, they're worse off today for having put up their hands for debt restructuring than they would have been had they not put up their hands. If you take a country like Cote d'Ivoire or even Senegal, one of the things that the African finance minister said was, give us liquidity, give us a suspension of our debt service payments. With the suspension of our debt service payments, so instead of paying my debt today, PPEs and save my people so we can go back to work quickly. That's what liquidity means. So things like the debt service suspension initiative are immediately putting money. So we had $11.9 billion worth of resources immediately put back into the pockets of countries and sovereigns so that they could deal with the crisis because we had a liquidity instrument in the debt service suspension initiative. All the countries that had access to the debt service suspension initiative, Senegal included, Cote d'Ivoire, then went on to the markets and were able to then raise additional financing to do better and then to help themselves in the medium to long term. So in some sense, liquidity allows you to deal with a short-term crisis, restructure your economy and keep going, as opposed to coming backwards. The liquidity and sustainability facility, which we have created, essentially today in Africa, when we issue bonds, those bonds are not liquid. And so again, even in the middle of a crisis, and I just want, the audience to think about it carefully. Even when we issue bonds, when Africa issues Euro bonds, we are essentially giving European pensioners and US pensioners the opportunity to buy into Africa's debt. When those bonds are very expensive, it is a net transfer from a developing country to a developed country. That's essentially what happens. So the inequity in the system continues. And so with the liquidity and sustainability facility, what we are trying to do is to say, can we take some of that inequity out? Because up until now, we have not had a secondary market for Africa's issuance of Eurobonds. A secondary market means when we issue the bond and a big financial institution buys it on behalf of pensioners, they don't know what to do with this security or this paper or this money that or this loan that they have lent to Africa. If you buy US Treasury bills today at 9 a.m. in the morning, at 9:05, you can go and sell it to a secondary market and get your liquidity, your cash back. Liquidity is an important conversation in the financial sector. With that cash back, so if you buy $1 billion worth of US Treasuries, you sell it in the secondary market, you can get 900 million, and you can go off and do many things. If you buy $1 billion worth of Cote d'Ivoire bonds, you can't do anything with it. You have to keep it for 5 years or 7 years, which means you must charge Cote d'Ivoire the cost of holding this money. What we are trying to do is take away that additional cost by providing a secondary market for liquidity. It also means that when there are crises, people can immediately come to this window and say, I have this asset, I'm going to give it to you as collateral. Can you give me liquidity so I can create fiscal space to buy vaccines, to buy PPEs, or even for climate change? Now we have the big conversation on loss and damage, right? When a climate crisis hits you, whether you're Ethiopia or Mozambique or Cape Verde or any other country, or Chad, or even Senegal, if you have a shortage or a shock on your agricultural produce, you need money immediately to be able to provide safety nets to your citizens. You can use this kind of a window immediately, as opposed to talk about debt crisis. So this is a little bit, the importance of liquidity, health, and how we go forward. And I think that as we continue to create some of these instruments, the Gate Foundation, Oumar, and that you are with, is also an important part of this, because once we have some liquidity, we can use that with the grants kind of resources that you provide to then see how, we provide for R&D research that can then help us to create production facilities in Senegal that allow us to move forward. So, but we must, even somebody who wants to invest in, the vaccine factory in Senegal expects to make a return. But for us to get to the point where the return starts, you need some grant money to start. The government needs to put some liquidity in for it to start. And so really one of the things we're talking about is liquidity is good. There are different kinds of liquidity. There's grant funding that comes from philanthropy. There is market liquidity that comes from creations of these kinds of instruments. And these instruments have existed in the developed world for 200 years. The other day I was at Bank of New York Mellon, as where the first 1789, the first liquidity collateral paper was created, 1789 in the United States. We don't yet have that in Africa. How many centuries later? So I think we need to bring that together, but we also need the MDBs, and I don't see anybody from the World Bank or the African Development Bank there, but we need that kind of concessional money to sort of bring it together. Since Oumar and I and Mohammed are all parts of it, so we can say that we're there to bring this conversation together. So I would stop here, but I think the relationship between liquidity, there's grants liquidity, market liquidity, concessional and IFI liquidity, and we need to bring all of that together to ensure that every time there's a crisis in Africa, we don't cry debt, but we bring those tools and resources together to help Africa continue to grow and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera, for making the case for liquidity. We don't have the MDBs here, but however, what we have former MDBs. When I think about Mohammed, myself, you, and just next to me. And also thank you for pushing the envelope for the continent, because you're right, there is inequity in the system. And I'm very happy to see you also now take on another fight with respect to the food crisis. So let me now turn to, I'm just looking at time, and I think we'll just have each participant just speak once. So let me go to, oh, we have another party, okay. Okay, please come on in. So let me now turn to Miriam Winworth, who is the CEO of Management Sciences for Health, and basically ask you, Miriam, in many of our countries, we're seeing a devolution of responsibility for provision of health services to the subnational level. To what extent do you think that globalization is a trend, and is there any direction in development assistance for Africa where funding will increasingly be extended to the local level? So in other words, any thoughts on devolution?
I have a lot of thoughts, sorry.
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts on local, that's for sure.
Okay.
I do think that there's this word running around, globalization, that I've been using that is occasionally, that's not very well defined, but it really does represent the notion that global plus local can be actually better than just colonization, essentially. And really what's important about those local efforts within country is that what's done is done well. It's done under with local decision making, and the way you judge, I'm not sure how you judge good, but the way I judge good is by what's done, how it's done, and what remains over time. I think those are all extremely important. I wanted to talk about one very interesting model that we've done around localization as a way to sort of illustrate things we should think about. So I have no firm answers for you, but I have, some experience to share. MSH founded about 4 years ago an organization called MedSource, which was meant to solve a local private sector problem. And that problem is, while it's a local problem, it's actually true across the continent, which is that individual small pharmacies and consumers pay USA prices for a product of very low quality. And they do so essentially because there are a lot of intermediaries in between. A small kiosk pharmacy is going to be buying from a little distributor who buys from a big distributor who buys from a bigger distributor. And all along the way, there's margin added, and there's the possibility of poor quality increases. And so what we did is talk to many local stakeholders within the government, within other business communities, et cetera. And established a company that disintermediates, that helps small pharmacies and small hospitals to get access to the big distributors, their prices and their quality assurance by vetting them, by creating a business that vets them, manages their purchasing, and puts it all on a digital platform. At this point, MedSource has 750 members, trades 7,000 products, and it's doubling in size every year. So it's a very, very nice model that isn't quite breaking even yet, but it's on its way to breaking even. And I kept notes around, you know, sort of some of the lessons learned. And so I'm going to read those, but they're very quick. There are 5. First, understand the local market extremely well. Solutions from Geneva or Seattle or Washington, D.C. won't yield all, they have some insights, but they won't necessarily yield all the appropriate insights. Best practices, of course, are the most valuable part. Build stakeholder support, especially local government, local businesses, and professional organizations, and find the right board. Be flexible. Our original design didn't work. We let our members and our customers actually help tell us how to change it and fix it. We had a logical design, but we soon learned what value could possibly be. Look at healthcare system solutions from the whole system, from government, from private sector, from civil society, from faith organizations. The answers can be anywhere in terms of solving long-term health problems. And be a little bit careful, because local solutions, if they come from the most powerful, may bias towards the status quo. And then finally, be humble and passionate. If you know what you're trying to accomplish, even if you didn't get the right measurement and evaluation plan at the beginning, and you know what you're trying to solve for, keep working towards that high-end goal, and expect that you're going to make a series of mistakes. I don't need to tell people in this room, because you attended this session for a reason, that there is a huge intersection between health and economics. That there can be win-win-win between health and economics. And I just wanted to share this example as one way to look at it and solve and create opportunity for health and for economic development. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those lessons, and also for amplifying the critical importance of connecting health and economics. Let me now turn to, I just want to make sure that I have the right participants. Is that Faustin Mokana? Oh, fantastic. And thank you for joining us. Faustin is the CEO of Africa Resource Center. You know, supply chain is very, very important in everything we do. As we think about some of the building blocks of health system, what are the key challenges in building efficient and robust end-to-end supply chains in the continent? Again, we are in a theme where so many things matter in order to get things right. And this is one of them. We were talking about just global, local now. Now it's supply chain. Anything that you would like to share with this audience? And we are time constrained, and I want to make sure everybody weighs in. Yeah. So if you can do like Miriam there, if there are one or two, a few takeaways to think about, what would those be?
Yeah, thank you, Oumar, for that, and thank you, Honorable Minister, our COLL. And sorry for the confusion on being on stage on time. If I have to share something, I'll put on my cap of 35 years of selling fast-moving consumer goods. And I would like to say that everything that we do has to start with the consumer in mind, and the consumer being the patient in this case, in terms of supply chain. How do we make sure that we get the products at the door of the consumer, not in the last mile, not in the last meter, but at the door of the consumer? And how do we do that? So there are too many, or there are enough of stakeholders in this room and in the world. Everyone, you know, looking to help and support. But I think it's important that we learn not to work in silo, and we accept that the person in the driving seat is the people, and the people are represented by the government. So it's important, in my views, that we let the government drive, and we come together, not as a silo, but to come together to support the government. And when I say the government has to drive, it has to be clear in the mind of government what are the priorities for health in the country for the next 3 to 5 years. And we have to come, all the stakeholders together, to support that strategy and to support those priorities. And you know, refrain from, and I'll use a strong word, from this arrogance of telling the government what to do. I think it's important that we align on the strategy and we understand the priorities and we put our heads together to support the government in the role that they're playing to support the people. And for that, I'll encourage the government to also look and listen to the partners, private sector. And when we're talking about private sector, the government need to understand that their core business is not logistics. There are people who are specialized in logistics. There are people who are specialized in moving boxes, and they need to work with those group of expertise. The other point, and I'm conscious of time, is someone mentioned it earlier, is about a smaller country or a country of deadlock cannot put together a manufacturing facility and expect to sell those products across. So it's important that we work with regional economic bodies, the like of COMESA, the like of ECOWAS, WAHU, and the African Union itself, so that all the member states can take benefit of that organization. And we could organize like ACAM, which is 22 countries in Francophone Africa, who are putting together a pool procurement system where, using that muscle, that energy, and those resources, they can influence and get benefit of what they do. And this is the way these private sector international companies have been working on the continent for 100 years, and they've been successful using that model. I think that the last point I would like to share, Oumar, is innovation on that last mile. We need to encourage that innovation to be happening, to find new ways, and to the point that was made by the lady just before, it's about how do they start, because there are so many incubators out there, but they just don't know how to start because they don't have resources. So we should be thinking about how to support those and avoid things that happen out there where people come out, university produces people and they come out there and they are being asked for experience before they can start work. So let's try and support innovators. Let's start and support incubators and see where we can get. Thank you.
Thank you for those lessons, and especially when you talk about innovation. When you talk about innovation, I'm thinking about the future. It's about the youth. Now let me turn to Mariama Abdou Gado. Mariama, on a souvent tendance à ne pas toujours penser à la jeunesse, alors qu'en fait la jeunesse c'est le futur. Donc j'aimerais savoir quelles sont les attentes de la jeunesse par rapport au sujet dont on est en train de parler, donc par rapport au futur de la santé et de la résilience économique en Afrique. Quelle perspective voulez-vous partager avec nous?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Tout d'abord, je voulais saisir l'occasion pour remercier notre maman, professeur Awa Marie Kolsek, pour m'avoir généreusement invité à participer à ce forum. Je disais hier que, en tant qu'agent de santé, activiste et entrepreneur social, c'est un réel plaisir, en tout cas, d'être là et de partager, apprendre et réfléchir avec les experts du domaine. Je voudrais, avant de partager nos attentes en tant que jeunes, dire que le fait de miser sur la jeunesse en Afrique, c'est vraiment miser sur l'avenir du continent, mais aussi le présent du continent. J'aime dire que la jeunesse, c'est l'avenir, mais la jeunesse, c'est aussi le présent. Et c'est maintenant que ça se passe. Nous savons que nous représentons une opportunité de développement incroyable à travers l'innovation, mais aussi la transformation sociale. Mais nous sommes également un capital humain inestimable. Aujourd'hui, nous représentons 102% de la population africaine. 200 millions de personnes en Afrique sont des jeunes. Et ça va doubler d'ici 2045. Donc, c'est vraiment un potentiel à capter, surtout quand on parle des questions de santé et de résilience économique. Et on sait qu'il n'y a pas de résilience économique sans résilience sanitaire, et il n'y a pas de résilience économique ni résilience sanitaire sans les jeunes. Et malheureusement, la COVID-19 nous a montré que nos systèmes de santé ne sont pas résilients. Et encore à ce niveau, c'est nous les jeunes qui avons apporté beaucoup de solutions à travers l'innovation, la technologie, pour permettre en tout cas aux services de santé de continuer à travers l'information, mais aussi l'auto-soin, etc. Et quand je pense à ce que nous voulons voir dans le futur, je vois des systèmes de santé qui sont efficaces d'abord, mais aussi qui sont résilients pour répondre à la problématique qu'on a vécue pendant la COVID-19. Et ça passe par le fait de pouvoir consulter la jeunesse. Donc, le fait que je sois là déjà est un grand pas, mais il faut aussi que ça se matérialise partout, surtout au niveau de nos pays, qu'on puisse être là quand les grandes stratégies sont élaborées et que ces stratégies aussi soient multisectorielles et que tous les jeunes avec toutes les spécificités puissent être là. Les jeunes vivant avec le handicap, avec le VIH-Sida, les jeunes déscolarisés, pour qu'on puisse parler de ces questions-là et dire qu'est-ce qui peut être mieux fait pour pouvoir améliorer les choses. Et traiter aussi de manière spécifique nos questions de santé, notamment la santé reproductive. Aujourd'hui, beaucoup de problèmes en termes de santé mentale aussi, on n'en parle pas beaucoup. Et également les questions de toxicomanie, on en voit énormément dans les écoles et même chez nous, les étudiants en médecine, où on voit beaucoup de personnes très, très compétentes, prometteuses, virer vers la toxicomanie et on perd un véritable capital. Et on sait aussi qu'on participe beaucoup à la mortalité maternelle et infantile. Les adolescentes participent énormément. Les adolescentes quittent les écoles à cause des grossesses non désirées et précoces. Donc, c'est des choses à prendre en compte. Nous avons dans la transformation digitale aussi. On a parlé de transformation digitale durant ce forum. On est là pour proposer des solutions innovantes. Et il faudrait aussi nous favoriser le parcours professionnel, nous les agents de santé, mais aussi dans les autres secteurs, qu'on puisse en tout cas apprendre, qu'on puisse acquérir de l'expérience et aussi occuper des postes de responsabilité pour apporter notre créativité. Et je pense aussi en termes de résilience sanitaire, c'est très important de faire de la résilience au niveau des structures de santé et aussi des systèmes de santé. Ça commence aussi par équiper les centres de santé comme il le faut, donner les ressources aux agents de santé, mais aussi revoir notre façon de faire l'offre de services. Il faut qu'on change, par exemple, les horaires d'accès aux centres de santé pour que ce soit accessible à tout le monde. Il faut qu'on puisse faire mobile outreach, c'est-à-dire aller vers là où les personnes sont, en fait, la délivrance de services mobiles. C'est à nous d'aller vers eux, surtout en période de crise. Ce n'est pas à nous de dire venez vers les centres de santé, mais allons vraiment vers ces personnes parce qu'en période de crise, c'est difficile de se déplacer. Utilisons le digital aussi. Faisons la mise à l'échelle de nos pratiques à haut impact. On en a énormément. Faisons la promotion aussi de la programmation basée sur les évidences, les données. Et c'est là où nous, les jeunes, on peut intervenir. On est les leaders dans nos communautés et on a accès en tout cas à des informations qui peuvent permettre d'améliorer la programmation. Quand je prends la résilience économique, je voudrais dire nous attendons que les engagements pris soient tenus. Je voudrais ici dire que je sais que les présidents et des États et gouvernements africains se sont réunis ici même à Dakar le 7 juillet 2022 et qu'ils ont pris des engagements pour saisir les opportunités à vue de répondre aux multiples crises, mais aussi pour orienter les économies dans des voies transformatrices en partenariat avec l'Association internationale de développement. Nous avons vu qu'il y a des engagements en lien avec la transformation économique, pour mieux répondre aux chocs, mais aussi des mesures en faveur d'un environnement propice à travers la bonne gouvernance et pas mal d'initiatives. Et je voudrais dire ici que quand on parle de transformation économique, il faut aussi penser au capital humain Et ça passe aussi par lutter contre le chômage chez nous, les jeunes Africains. Aujourd'hui, c'est 55% de jeunes qui chôment en Afrique subsaharienne. C'est énorme et ça ne nous permet pas de faire de la résilience économique. Il faut qu'on soit compétitif sur le marché. Le système traditionnel de l'éducation que nous avons en Afrique ne marche plus. Aujourd'hui, nous sortons, on nous demande une expérience qu'on n'a pas appris à l'école. Il faut créer à l'école des cadres qui nous permettent d'apprendre et avoir cette expérience. Et quand nous sortons, nous sommes directement valables en fait sur le marché et nous pouvons coopter les opportunités, travailler et apporter le changement qu'il faut dans nos communautés. Dernière chose, je pense aussi qu'il est important de favoriser la résilience individuelle et communautaire quand on parle de résilience économique. On sait que ce sont les individus et les communautés résilientes qui vont permettre à notre économie d'être résiliente. Et je voulais ici dire que ça passe par l'éveil de conscience. Il faut que dans les communautés, nous puissions venir et dire qu'est-ce que vous êtes déjà en train de faire en termes de résilience? Parce que les communautés sont déjà résilientes, mais les aider aussi à co-créer. On co-crée avec eux des stratégies de résilience, on les laisse implémenter, on fait l'évaluation avec eux et ça nous permet d'avoir des résultats durables parce que quand on s'en va, on sait quand même qu'ils vont continuer le travail. Il faudrait qu'on puisse faire ce qu'on appelle un focus particulier sur les jeunes et les femmes, parce qu'on sait que les femmes subissent vraiment de manière disproportionnée les crises et les chocs. Et il faut les autonomiser à être capables. Quand elles comprennent les problèmes et qu'elles les prennent à bras le corps, c'est toute la communauté qui les comprend. Et les jeunes, c'est toujours la créativité, c'est la connaissance des problématiques sur le tas, en fait. C'est vraiment l'expérience que les programmeurs n'ont pas dans leur bureau, que nous avons sur le terrain, qu'il faut savoir coopter et travailler donc avec nous. C'est ce que on a pas mal d'autres attentes, mais compte tenu du temps, je vais m'en arrêter là et dire que les jeunes sont un potentiel incroyable qui fait déjà beaucoup de choses sans ressources, mais qu'il faut appuyer, accompagner et leur donner les ressources qu'il faut. Et vous allez voir, nous allons faire des choses incroyables.
Merci Mariama pour cet exposé magnifique et aussi pour être aussi engagé. Et donc we've run out of time now, but we cannot leave without giving Dr. Ohiri an opportunity to say a word about the private sector, which is a bigger part of the solution. Dr. Ohiri, we're very, very sorry. We're just giving a couple of minutes just to say a word because we are on our way to the presidency and have actually missed our deadline. But we could not have afforded to let you on the call. And thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, thank you for the invitation. And I'll start on all the protocols and I appreciate everyone who has put this together. And because we're time constrained, I'll just make just three just broad points. I think the first is really about the role of the private sector. We know that previous studies over time have highlighted its importance. And so there was no doubt about that because many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have mixed healthcare systems. But the recent global events really, I think, brought that to the fore again, and things like the COVID pandemic, the strain it placed on public health systems and the reliance on the private health sector to actually augment what the governments were providing. The disruption in supply chains and the inability to travel meant there was no outbound medical tourism. So this created three things. One, the realization that we needed to strengthen and make local health systems more resilient and focusing on the role the private sector had to play. And then secondly, the renewed call for more investments in the sector across the entire value chain. And then thirdly, the fact that healthcare markets were no longer limited to the boundaries of countries or cities, and therefore the need for collective action across national and regional levels, not just from a public sector perspective, but also from a private sector perspective. Second main point is really that the way the private sector, health sector works, it's almost at a low level equilibrium. And this private sector we speak of, it's extremely fragmented and very heterogeneous, comprising for-profit, not-for-profit, domestic, formal, informal subsectors, etc. And what this low-level equilibrium has resulted in is, low quality of care, inability to attract the requisite financing. So, for instance, in 2021, the healthcare sector accounted for 8% of by volume of investments, private equity investments on the continent, but 3% of deal volume in total. So opportunities exist, therefore, to actually attract more investments and finding a way to address some of the constraints that make it difficult for the private sector to mobilize additional resources to the sector. And we could go into that in a lot more detail, but I'll leave it there. But thirdly, the third point I just wanted to make is to end this with talking about the opportunities that exist, really. Historically, it was thought that there was a clear delineation between the public sector addressing things that have a public good nature. So investing in pandemic preparedness and control, etc., and that the private sector could focus distinctly on merry goods for those who could actually afford it. But what we've seen is that these roles overlap significantly. And so we've seen an opportunity to reimagine healthcare systems and leapfrog what currently exists. So we do not have the same path dependency as some of the higher income countries have. We actually could build a mixed healthcare system that's focused more on preventive care, but one that also leverages digital health and technology to improve access to millions of people. And secondly, we see that even across the different segments, we coined a term called the health poor.
If you don't stop it now, I am so sorry. We are being
Sure. I'm just wrapping this up now. And so we just see the role that the private sector, the opportunities that could be harnessed. And in FHERA, we're just focusing on three things: the regulatory environment, the access to finance, and the role that digital innovation and technology can play. So I'll just pause here. Thank you for the opportunity and look forward to more discussions.
Thank you. And apologies to all the participants we could not have brought in here. And sincere apologies, particularly to Dr. Isabel Mazzurera, and we will be apologizing to you formally offline. Really, thank you to all the participants. We could have stayed a little bit longer and have a summary and hear from the audience, but we have no choice but to leave now, otherwise we're in trouble. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Pour la 5e année consécutive, le Forum Galien Afrique se déroule en terre sénégalaise du 6 au 9 décembre 2022. Le Forum Galien Afrique offrira une plateforme d'échange exceptionnelle autour du thème « Accélérer la marche de l'Afrique vers la couverture sanitaire universelle ». Placé sous la présidence effective de son Excellence M. Macky Sall, président de la République du Sénégal, le Forum Galien Afrique réunira des experts scientifiques des secteurs de la santé, de l'économie, de l'environnement, d'éminentes personnalités politiques et de la société civile, d'anciens récipiendaires de prix Nobel, des universitaires et des centaines d'étudiants en médecine et pharmacie, ainsi que des jeunes innovateurs. Cette 5e édition du forum, avec 1500 participants, sera organisée en format présentiel et virtuel avec, du 6 au 9 décembre 2022, un forum des jeunes, un forum des femmes et un forum scientifique. Le vendredi 9 décembre 2022 se tiendra une cérémonie en présentiel au cours de laquelle, pour la seconde fois, le prix Galien Afrique, qui consacre la recherche, l'innovation, la santé et la technologie, sera décerné. Du 6 au 9 décembre, le Forum Galien Afrique fait de Dakar la capitale africaine de la santé, de l'innovation et de la recherche.